there, and welcome to Mark and Carrie in our never-ending podcast about the same two topics, and that would be the American election and COVID. How are you doing, Mark?
We talk about other things occasionally.
We do.
We do. And we've got a few of them we can talk about today. We don't just have to be stuck with that. But nonetheless, I mean, it is... I would put it this way. How are you enjoying your slow-moving coup d'etat in the home of democracy?
It feels like a slow-moving cold, which is that it's always there lingering, never kind of goes away. It's just always looming over your head and doesn't really end. So I guess I'm hanging in there. How are you?
I mean, I'm surviving. I tend to think of this, because of the influence of my friend Alex Cooley, as the Central Asian dictator's problem. Right? I think I've said this before on the podcast, but essentially, what is the Central Asian dictator's problem? The problem is you've probably done some naughty stuff when you were in office, or alternatively, you owe so much money that you don't want to leave office. And this also applies to the people that you've brought in with you. So there's a kind of collective group that have a huge interest in not moving. So what you do is you seed the ground before you lose, just in case you lose, by saying that everything is obviously fraud, which he'd been doing for months before with the whole mail-in ballot thing. And then, lo and behold, I mean, credit where credit is due. He increased his vote by 2 million. We should talk about this. He increased his vote amongst women, proving that misogyny pays off. I'd like you to address that one in particular. He managed to increase his vote with Latinos, despite demonizing the whole lot. So, so much for identity politics following easily along political lines. But nonetheless, he lost. And having lost, he's now ceded the ground, and it's all a big fraud, etc., etc. In a sense, he completely telegraphed this is the way it's going to go. So why is anybody surprised that this is the way it's going?
I think it's because there was so much, this is going to happen. Worst case scenario, is this going to happen? And then it is happening. And so we are surprised because you thought it was just a bad movie that was actually going to come to an end. But you were exactly right. I mean, along those demographic lines, and I have more to say to that, and I have a few questions for you too. But also just that, why did we ever, to your point, think that he was going to give this up easily? He's got a TV channel, station conglomerate to build. He's shopping around $100 million book deal. Just in comparison, the Obamas, both Michelle and Barack, got $65 million together. So of course, that's got to be really important to him. He's got, all these other business ventures that he's got to get going, because he's got to be thinking where his next paycheck is. So to set this up and remain relevant so he can continue to raise money for his PAC and his TV and all this stuff, this has to be the drumbeat for him. And did we think that he wasn't going to want to continue to be the center of the universe? I mean, so you're exactly right on all of these points.
But what if it's more than that? What if it's more than he's just looking for his exits? What if it's really the case that, let me give you the example of Georgia. There you have two sitting senators that have come out against their own guy who certifies elections, who's a Republican, and insisted on his resignation because of quote unquote massive fraud, when we know there isn't any. Actually, all that happened was that Stacey Abrams managed to basically rebuild the voter rolls and get rid of the voter suppression largely that was there. But notwithstanding, that's a sort of a civil war going on within the party, right? I mean, you've got people who are like, no, we're doubling down. We're staying. We're not going.
And yes, exactly. And it's because he got X 70 million votes or whatever he got added to his margins in terms of the rural population, women, Latino men. And that this is the ideological fight. I mean, people keep talking about the ideological fight in the Democratic Party. This is in the Republican Party as well, that Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, who's like a, second-tier senator, they are terrified. They want Trump to come down and do rallies for them. They want him to get the base excited in Georgia. Otherwise, they don't really, what else do they really have to run on? Especially those two, there's not a huge amount of policy for them to run on. So I think it's this combination that we've talked about of it's just the power play. We have to remain on Trump's side and make sure that we're saying stuff that he likes, because otherwise there's a tweet, there's a fill in the blank something that's going to bite us.
And there's also the risk of simply being primaried, right?
Yes.
If you come out now and recognize Biden, you're done. It's over. You've just signed your own electoral death warrant. So there's a kind of, if you will, institutional incentive in here that's keeping the Republican Party online, because it's not that Trump excites the base. Trump is the base. This is what he proved, right? The polls, once again, were wildly off. And he increased his vote by 2 million, despite every prognosticator saying, oh, well, this is the death of Trumpism, blah, 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 blah. Look at the numbers. So, no, the party is utterly beholden to this guy, and he's maximizing his leverage, which suggests to me that he might actually be considering not just getting the book deal and exiting. So walk me through the constitutional machinery on this, or the constitutional shenanigans, right? Let's just work on the assumption that Trump is really trying to stay there. How could he do it? Could he do it?
I mean, the crucial parts are states and governors, so local election officials certifying the results, then governors certifying those results and proceeding with all the paperwork, and also selecting electors to send to the electoral college. And this is like kind of boring stuff, but what's interesting is this whole notion of faithless electors. And the reason to bring this up is, of course, in the battleground states, where states have Republican legislatures and Democratic governors, Pennsylvania, you could have a faithless elector or electors. The Supreme Court ruled last year on this, that there would upheld legal penalties against faithless electors. So there's that stuff that could happen. Electoral College meets December 14th. All state stuff has to be certified by December 8th. And this is also important, Blyth, because that's also when any sort of legal stuff has to be settled by December 8th. So at least that part of things may at least kind of come to a close for the moment. But then, I mean, this opens up, two pathways. Like everything kind of goes normal with the Electoral College. And then you see just this sort of normal transition of power, even without a concession speech. Or we go on the weird path, or the uncharted path, which is that things don't get certified by states and by the larger government. And then we're in a real gray area. How does President Trump get escorted out on January 20th? What exactly happens in those weeks and days leading up?
And is there any chance that, having stacked the Supreme Court with conservatives, he's trying to do a Hail Mary pass to the Supreme Court? Can he go that way? Or is that just not happening?
Oh, I mean, I think that's clearly what he wants. And it's similar to how we started things. You're right. He's telegraphing this already. But it's hard to know what case is going to come before the court, before the Supreme Court. Everything has been knocked down. And I mean, I was just reading some transcripts yesterday where judges asked, are you presenting any evidence about election fraud? And the lawyer said no. And so it's nothing. It's based on just air. It's hard to see, but of course, everything's possible of a president refusing to leave the White House on January 20th.
Okay, so let's leave that topic, which we always talk about, and go to the other topic we always talk about, which is COVID.
COVID. COVID has come back in a second or third or whatever wave we're on.
Again, can we remind ourselves that we were told this would happen?
Yes.
Like in March, everyone was told by those experts who tend to be right sometimes that this would happen and it would be worse than the first wave. And we went, oh, okay, fair enough. And then we made it through the summer, and then guess what? It's exactly what they said. Why are we so bad at absorbing information?
This doesn't seem to be a totally American problem, though. And I usually would think it is because, we just think we can do whatever. But this also is happening in Europe. I mean, so the UK went, I don't know if they're calling it a lockdown or a partial shutdown, but starting for a month, happening right now till December 2nd. Germany, France, Portugal, Spain, Hungary. So it doesn't seem to be that just Americans are being obtuse about this, but across the globe, except for Asia, who knows some secret that the rest of us don't. What do you make of that?
So it's interesting, again, and a lot of this is media coverage, right? I mean, because the Democratic strategy of defeating Trump was so much on the mishandling of the pandemic, there was a certain reluctance to report upon the fact that for the past month, the numbers in Europe have been going up. And when you control for population, in many cases, Belgium, for example, is way worse than the United States. So, there's that to contend with. But again, I go back to the point that we were told this would happen. right? I mean, the whole point of government, right, and we criticize the United States for this all the time, is you've hollowed out your administrative capacities, you've dismantled the state, little wonder you can't get your stuff together, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, Europe's meant to be the place that hasn't done that, and it turns out they're just as incompetent. And the British response has gone from tragedy to farce. I mean, instead of actually having no lockdown or a lockdown, Boris invented this thing called tiers. You'd be in T1, Tier 2 or Tier 3. Manchester can't actually decide which tier it's in and so on and so forth. Needless to say, the joke is it'll all end in tears, right? But, but the end of it, you know, it's a mess. It's a total mess. Now, what's going on? As you say, you know, then you go to somewhere like China and you can blame communism and authoritarianism. All right, but what about Singapore?
Yeah.
It's a very different version. And it seems to be, and again, you know, the Swedes who were looking bad again now look better again. It's high trust societies or alternatively very high capacity societies where people follow rules.
Yeah.
Where you get places where they tell the state to go take a running jump, Spain, England, Italy, United States, that you get trouble.
Yeah. Well, and the contact tracing, it seems to be a huge deal as well, that most of the, at least American numbers, I would presume, though I don't know across Europe, similar, that is coming from the being inside with your friends and family and inviting people over for a birthday party and that sort of stuff, and just kind of letting your guard down. And then people getting sick, and there's no way for us to sort out where the source of that is.
Yeah, I mean, so think about the fact that the United States has two events coming up now, which are going to be massive amplifiers.
Yeah.
One is Thanksgiving. And then, given the 3-week incubation period, right after that, Christmas.
Yes.
So it's a double amplifier. I mean, this is literally baked into the calendar. We knew this was coming. So again, I go back to the why is everybody surprised?
Yeah. So I was surprised with Pfizer coming out with news on their vaccine with 90% efficacy. I mean, I think Fauci said that he was hopeful for 50% efficacy.
Yeah.
So that seems like there may be some dim light at the end of the COVID tunnel.
I think that's right. And I think, you know, the market turnaround was remarkable in a sense, you know, there's no information in markets. It's mainly sentiment, emotion and momentum, if you will. And they'd been trending down for about 10 days. And out comes this announcement and everyone's like, woohoo, it's euphoria time. British Airways stock went up 40%. Right, on the news of a vaccine. It's like, okay, now let's factor in what this means. This is really good. But we have to think about a few things. You're going to have to vaccinate in the first round about 1 billion people.
Yeah.
This vaccine needs cryogenic storage, like 80 degrees minus. It's not easy to move that stuff around. What exactly are the logistics for getting in place specific centres with the correct tech, with the amount of the vaccine, moving it around the world? So, you know, I think what happens then is people begin to look at that over the next 36 hours and process it and say, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it just went back, but there's still a light.
Yeah.
Now, it changes, I think, the calculus of governments, because it might enable them to be a little bit harsher on the lockdowns coming, on the grounds that by the time we get to the spring, look, we really will have this thing under control. So this is just one more time, let's do it. And in a sense, that's what they said in March. Right? Yes. I mean, we forget this all the time. What was literally said in March was going to be bad just now, it'll ease up in the summer, it'll get really bad in the winter, and we hope to have a vaccine next year. Kind of on track for where we're meant to be.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I do feel like expectations in terms of the distribution of the vaccine is being set right now, that is 3 to 6 months, and that it's not January 1st. We can all go back to normal. We'll all have access to it as well. It's such an interesting point that you make about the market, that it's about sentiment and not necessarily about where I mean, I'm just thinking the president always talked about the stock market was having huge days and what that would mean for the economy. I wanted to go back to one thing about the election. That's Latinos. And I'm curious about, there's a lot of talk about Cubans in Miami-Dade County and the way that they voted for Trump. And one of the reasons why was because they don't like the socialist message. Does that ring true with you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a friend who's Venezuelan, and, you know, he talks about his family back home and the restrictions they're under and the fact that they can't get money out of the bank and food is hard to come by and the government's run by thugs. And, you know, it's not as if this guy was a dyed-in-the-wool Pinochet supporter, far from it. So I think that for those communities, in a sense, the Cuban one is a sort of an echo of past repression, and the Venezuelan one. I mean, Venezuela has generated more refugees than Syria. We totally forget about this, right? There's 3.5 million of them out of their own country. They're just packed up and left because it's so crap, right? So I think for those communities, that absolutely does resonate. Now, is this real socialism? Is this social democracy? Is this what lefty activists in the Democratic Party are talking about? These are all sort of very different issues. But I think there's something very interesting going on here. You know about that phone call, the post-mortem phone call as to why the Democrats didn't win more seats in Congress and the House was disappointing. So there was a pile-on. Someone, I think she may have been from Georgia, basically said, socialism killed us. You guys on the left need to shut the hell up, right? Now, if you look at Miami, right, and other places that really are important in terms of winning presidential elections, you can tell me whether this is important for the House or not, right? That makes sense. But here's what's also true. If it wasn't for those lefty activists and Black Lives Matter activists, you wouldn't have got close in Georgia.
Yeah.
Right? You wouldn't have got Michigan, right? None of that would have happened. So how do you square these two simultaneous truths within one party that basically one side wants to negate the other?
Yeah.
I don't know how that works out over the long term. I don't know how you square that circle.
I mean, this is the fight. Well, I think in both parties, in that on one hand, you have House districts that are so gerrymandered that they're going to produce certain types of candidates. And then on the other hand, you have senators that represent an entire state, which is, of course, much more diverse. I mean, it's this, and I don't think there is an answer to it. And until we tried Clinton and the third way and all this sort of stuff, and even Biden, moderate, total centrist, and people are already chomping at his ankles, saying everything that he's going to do is not going to be progressive enough. But I think this is stuff that just has to be forever going to be talked about, because there's no solution to this. The far left is always going to be really annoyed at the moderates and the more centrist. I mean, the Republican Party with the Tea Party members, aka Trumpism, have to deal with the same sort of thing. I think they're just better at being unified.
Because you know what you're against. The other one is a kind of an ideological othering that happens on both of these constituencies. I know it better I've studied it on the right, but you can also see it on the left. And it goes something like this. If you're on the left and you really are a left activist, when you encounter conservatism, it's an error. Right? There's something wrong with these people, right? And if we just kind of give them the right information or whatever, they'll see the world like me. And no, they won't. That will never happen. It's actually structural. There are people out there who are conservative. That's the way it is. It's not an error. It's just who they are. And there's a kind of an inability to sort of get to grips with that. And I think that basically the male Latino vote is just a great example of this. I grew up working class Catholic. So to a certain extent, I've got a little bit of insight into what might be going on there, right? So you're telling me that a bunch of sort of, conservative Catholic men, right, may have a set of values that are orthogonal to those that are expressed by the Democratic left. I'm shocked. I'm literally shocked. And of course, I'm quoting Casablanca. I am not shocked, right? But that's it. There is this kind of shock. It's like, what do you mean Latinos don't vote that way? Well, they can be conservative too. They're allowed to be conservatives.
Yes. I mean, I think you made this point on Twitter, which is that Joe from Scranton, Pennsylvania didn't talk to the regular Joes. And we talk about this too. I mean, Democrats, you're right. I mean, they say stuff like media literacy. And I mean, as someone, I understand what those words mean, but I'm with you. I grew up middle class in Michigan. Like, people say that, you're just like, what are you even talking about, media literacy? And there's just people vote, and I vote because of these reasons. Maybe I can articulate them, maybe I can't. But I think this is one reason why the polls were so wrong as well, is that just the regular, normal people, which I feel like I am one of, we just don't speak in these particular ways or think about it in that way. Like, the academic part of me can turn that, but it's not a way that I think that Democrats are able to talk to voters that outside of these sort of bites.
Another way that you see this in the post-election commentary is the fact that we've now decided that the most important dividing line in the country is education.
Yeah.
Now, let's think about how insulting this is, right? That basically you are now either educated or uneducated.
Yeah.
Right? So anyone who doesn't vote the way that we like must be, oh, look, it's in the numbers, they're uneducated. Now, what are they actually measuring? They're measuring college degree as a proxy for skills, right? Yeah. When you graduate from a program at a high-end university, you might acquire some skills, but what you're actually doing is joining a network.
Yep.
And you're already in the coastal growth nodes and you can afford to move to Boston and all the rest of it, right? That's what's really going on in terms of the schism underlying this. And yet we're coding this as a simple thing of like, some people are smarter than others. I mean, it's almost as if we wake up in the morning and say, how can we insult half of America?
Yeah, exactly. And then you wonder where the rage comes from when it's like, what are you, you stupid elites, eating your arugula in Back Bay. And your point about Latino, I just want to stop on this for a second, because I think it's so right that this notion that you identify as a particular gender, race, and therefore it just equals D. And that, I mean, there were all sorts of things that the Trump administration was doing that didn't get to the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post that was really courting Latino votes, and where they were using all of the stuff that brings people to their side around religious liberty, around economic individualism, the law and order stuff. And so then you see the results of that, of Trump picking up tons of vote in southern Texas. And so why Texas doesn't go blue is really attributed to that. But it wasn't, I mean, I think we talked about this a long time ago in the summer around the Goya Beans, the CEO. I mean, this is like the direct stuff that Trump was doing, and, everyone made fun of it, but those were sort of the direct appeals that his campaign was making to that particular constituency. So, Blyth, back to your shocking. This is really going to shock you. Uber spent $200 million on their ballot initiative in California to classify workers as contractors. And of course, the shocking part for you is that they spent $200 million on this, which is actually pretty cheap, thinking about how much it would have cost them to classify the drivers and the workers as actual employees. But a surprise referendum coming out of what we would think of as liberal California, and the voters would support changing the status of those particular workers.
No, absolutely. I mean, Biden's for $15 an hour as a minimum wage, but he's not doing anything at all about the increasing kind of precariousness of the labor market that happens when you generalize gig work. Now, there's no doubt about the fact that, gig work is important to many constituencies. Some people do fancy the flexibility, etc. It enables you to top up wages. But if you stop there and think for a minute, you're working two jobs because the one full-time job you already have doesn't pay enough. And now you're running your car into the ground just to get enough money to survive. That's not really a sustainable model. But nonetheless, when you spend $200 million in advertising, you can convince people that it is.
Yeah.
That tells you something again. We've been looking at big tech recently in terms of Amazon and monopoly power and pricing. And then you talk about Facebook and misinformation, and are these media platforms rather than anything, media platforms and media companies. This is another example that essentially these companies get to structure their own labor markets. Right?
That's such a good point.
That's big. We really need to stop and look at this. You're allowing corporations to take entire territories in the United States and decide what the rules should be for employing people. That is a massive failure of the state. And for the Democrats not to be all over this, I just find it incredible. Right.
That's such a good point. And because the government isn't providing any sort of structure by which to offer an alternative to that. And actually, it was surprising to me, in contra to this, was that Florida just passed a $15 minimum wage out of the election. One thing that does unite us is marijuana. Several states legalized personal use of pot: Arizona, Montana, Jersey, South Dakota, Mississippi passed legalization of medical marijuana. So this is one thing that unites all the 50 states.
Yeah, in these moments of tension and volatility and trauma, I suppose getting baked is as reasonable an outcome as you could possibly expect. Has Rhode Island done it yet, or are we sort of this holdout of probity, which would be very odd for Rhode Island?
Rhode Island is medical, I believe, but of course...
Is it medical? Oh,
yeah,
right,
but you could just go to your friend, to Boston to get some legal stuff.
I think you can just go to Fall River. You don't even need to drive that far.
Yes. Right, just across the border. Yeah.
So what else has been going on? Has there been anything actually interesting? Anything good, bad, sad? Oh, I'll tell you one. Here's a personal one. Sean Connery.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Did you see my tweet about this?
I did see your tweet about it.
Right. So for those who don't follow me on Twitter, can't imagine why. You might have better things to do with your time. So back in 1990, I got admitted to Columbia to do my PhD. And for some weird reason, which I won't go into, they paid my fees, but they didn't give me a stipend. But anyway, I then took this and found about this thing called the Scottish International Educational Trust, which it turns out was set up by Sean Connery in 1971 with the £500,000, $1 million that he got for his fee for Diamonds Are Forever. And it was then invested, and it was used to basically enable people to pursue international education, Scots in particular, in fact, exclusively. And I took my admissions letter to them and said, here, I'm a working class scumbag from Dundee. I just got into Columbia, but they didn't give me any fees. Can you help me out? And they did. They paid for the whole of my first year.
Wow.
So I used to say that, I was able to eat and drink due to the profits of Highlander 2, but it turned out, in fact, that it wasn't Highlander 2, it was actually Diamonds Are Forever, which is an infinitely better film than Highlander 2. So when he died, just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was a bit of a sad one. But the good news was that the Trust had been in touch with me as sort of one of their success stories, and I've now become a patron of the Trust. So if you go on the website, you'll see patrons, and it's Sir Jackie Stewart, Sir Sean Connery, Chris Hoy, Kirsty Walk, these are famous Scottish people, and me.
Wow.
Like, oh, nice comment.
Well,
so, I'll need to do something to justify it at some point, but nonetheless, that was an interesting story coming out of, a bit of sadness, but also with a personal connection.
Soon you'll have a crown on your head. But I didn't realize that Sean Connery had philanthropic endeavors either. I mean,
well, that was it. Yeah. I mean, apparently he was very much a sort of, self-educated autodidact type person. I mean, he was a bodybuilder who was a milkman from a town called Leith, north of Edinburgh. But he took this very seriously and was thinking about this way back in the 1970s. So, yeah, I mean, he absolutely has done.
Well, before celebrities
way before it was cool.
Yeah. I always think of him in The Hunt for Red October.
One ping Vasily.
Yeah.
There are so many good lines in The Hunt for Red October. So before I went to Columbia, I actually spent a year learning Russian. I don't know if you knew this about me.
Oh, no. Jeez.
Yeah, I did. And if you want to say in Russia, it is time, you say "это пора." And the very first scene spoken is Sam Neill, who does a reasonable Russian accent. He comes out and says, "Captain, is it time to go?" And Sean Connery turns to him and goes, "Da, это пора." So it's like Russian in Sean Connery's best Sean Connery accent, which is just truly brilliant and ridiculous simultaneously.
That's really good. I didn't realize you have such you're a real Renaissance man.
No, yes. I can do Sean Connery accents and everything.
Yeah. So I know you know this because you watch world events and are not only focused on America, but did you notice that the Berlin airport, BER, as opposed to TXL, and I can't remember what the other airport code is in Berlin, has now opened. SWF has now opened.
Yes, it has, finally. So it's a brilliant story about the whole Brandenburg airport. Because of course we think of Germany as this like culture that's great at engineering and does infrastructure and all that sort of stuff, and of course it's a bit of a lie. I mean, they haven't been investing for years. They've been something I've written about, they're obsessed with balancing their budget, which means that you never actually run a deficit, so you can't possibly invest in things to get a return later on, blah blah blah. But the story with the airport's actually much simpler. Berlin City Council decided to be cheap and they wouldn't actually hire a general contractor. They would do the general contracting. Now, if you've ever tried to do anything like just like get a house done, right? If you want to be your own GC, good luck. Yeah. Because there are so many moving parts, right? And they knew they were in trouble a few months into it when they realized that one part of the design team had been changing the height between the floors, and nobody had told the guys who were making the escalators.
So, it's also American.
So 2 years later, they delivered these escalators and they literally didn't join up the floors. And the whole thing was like that. A complete shambles. So now they finally opened it in the middle of a pandemic when nobody's actually traveling.
Yes.
Yeah. it's a bit of a shocker. But there we go. They made it. Way.
So I was actually reading a case study on this by the Hertie School of Governance. And so, of course, they cited the general contractor. And they also seemed to cite who was the project manager of this. And it was, of course, like a fancier title than that. But just that there were so many cooks in the kitchen and that it was hard. I mean, sort of the, as I think from the outside, the stereotypical German efficiency and it seemed that it was so, the information backlog and flow was just never clear on that. So that made me chuckle only because it just seemed like so un-German in that way.
So there's a serious point in here. I mean, apart from sort of turns out the Germans can screw up too, right?
Yeah.
Is that big infrastructure projects are pretty complex. And if you have a kind of fractured and fragmented state, I hope your Hertie School of Governance case actually talked about this.
Yep.
The problem here is that Berlin is a weak state. Right, and it's fractional and divided. So the whole thing becomes a political football. Now, just rinse and repeat that for the United States.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're thinking about doing a massive Green New Deal, one of the things that gets, which I'm very much in favour of, one of the things that gets overlooked on here is state capacity. Right? And apparently the designed to fail Florida Unemployment Benefits Office, right, literally was designed to turn away 4 out of 5 claims, was still running computers that were 486DX chips. I don't actually think, Carrie, you were born when they had those computers. So we're running 40-year-old equipment. The way that we fix that is we hire a consultancy firm for gajillions of dollars to come in and tell us that our problem is we have old equipment. And we go, thanks. And then we don't change the equipment, right? The ability, and this speaks to COVID and a whole host of things, your ability to solve problems is contingent upon your capacity. And if you basically screw up capacity, even the Germans can screw up.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important point in thinking about the distribution of the vaccine. Does the United States or fill in the blank state have the capacity to actually distribute this thing in a way that gets it out to individuals and people? And frontline workers or the first group of people that will get it. Well, that was a long episode, lots to cover. This ongoing saga will hopefully will wrap up. Though probably will not now that I've said that. But it was great to see you.
Yes, exactly. Let's do one before Christmas and find out where we are. Let's find out. Let's find out if the man himself has vacated the premises or whether he's still there, which would give us exactly the same focal point to come back and talk again about the election and COVID, the never-ending story.
Yes, and we can also wrap up whether Boris Johnson's threat to cancel Christmas actually comes true.
That's true. It's true. And he is a bit Grinch-like. Sort of like a kind of... he's kind of like a drunk, posh Grinch. Sort of, no, Christmas for you. No.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.